Welcome to Life Stories. Sometimes, the most unexpected moments lead us to the people who change our lives forever. Brandon Whitmore, a billionaire CEO, never trusted easily, but when he met Olivia, a hard-working, pregnant waitress with a quiet strength, he found himself drawn to her resilience and honesty. What started as a simple test turned into something much deeper, a journey of trust, redemption, and love. Will Olivia open her heart to a new future? And will Brandon finally find something worth more than wealth? Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. Brandon Whitmore had never been a man to trust easily. In his world, trust wasn't freely given, it was earned, measured, and tested like the figures in his company's financial reports. People were often predictable when faced with temptation, and he had spent years watching the way greed, ambition, or even desperation made them falter. That was why, on a crisp autumn morning in Charleston, he found himself sitting in the far corner of a small, rustic cafe called the Seaside Haven. It was the kind of place that felt worlds away from the sleek, glass-walled offices and high-end restaurants he usually occupied. The wooden tables bore the marks of time, scratches, initials carved by nameless lovers, and the occasional coffee ring that had never been wiped away properly. The scent of sea salt drifted in from the nearby shore, mixing with the warm aroma of fresh pastries. It was simple, unassuming, and yet, it had a warmth that corporate boardrooms and luxury lounges could never replicate. Brandon sipped his black coffee, his sharp gaze moving through the cafe, studying the people inside without seeming too obvious. But it wasn't just the cafe's charm that had caught his interest, it was one person in particular. The waitress. She moved swiftly between the tables, balancing trays with the kind of ease that came from years of practice. Her name tag read Olivia, and she couldn't have been older than her mid-20s. There was a quiet resilience in the way she carried herself, despite the exhaustion that lingered in her eyes. What intrigued him the most, however, was her pregnancy. The loose apron she wore did little to hide the curve of her belly, a clear sign that she was well into her third trimester. And yet, she was still here, working, serving, smiling at every customer as if she didn't have a single worry in the world. Brandon leaned back in his chair, curiosity stirring inside him. He had seen determination before, but this was something else. Was she working because she had no choice? Did she have anyone supporting her? Or was there another reason entirely? When she finally reached his table, her smile was polite but slightly rushed. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" Brandon studied her for a moment before answering. "Coffee, black, and whatever pastry you'd recommend." She nodded, quickly scribbling down his order. "Coming right up." But before she could leave, he gestured toward her name tag. "Olivia, right?" She hesitated, clearly surprised. "Yes. Have we met before?" "No," Brandon said simply. "Just curious. How long have you worked here?" Her expression grew more guarded, as if she wasn't sure why he was asking. "Almost 2 years. Do you enjoy it?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. For a moment, she hesitated before offering a neutral reply. "It's honest work. Pays the bills." That wasn't an answer. Not really. She didn't linger, disappearing behind the counter to prepare his coffee. And Brandon watched her go, the gears in his mind turning. She wasn't like most people he met. There was no attempt to impress him, no unnecessary flattery, just a quiet determination to do her job and move on. When she returned with his order, placing a steaming cup of coffee and a warm, buttery croissant in front of him, Brandon decided to test her. Reaching into his wallet, he pulled out a crisp $100 bill and slid it across the table. "For the recommendation," he said casually. Olivia glanced at the bill, then back at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That's very generous," she said, her voice polite but firm. "But I can't accept it." "Why not?" She hesitated for just a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "Because I didn't do anything to earn it." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "You're working hard, aren't you? Isn't that enough?" Shaking her head, she gently pushed the bill back toward him. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm just doing my job. Enjoy your meal." And with that, she walked away before he could argue further. Brandon watched her retreating figure, intrigued. Most people, especially those struggling financially, would have taken the money without hesitation. He had seen it time and time again. But Olivia had refused. And not out of pride, but principle. That was rare. Finishing his coffee, Brandon found himself thinking about her long after she had walked away. There was something extraordinary about her, something honest, something real. He wasn't used to that. In his world, honesty often had a price. And most people were willing to compromise it when given the right incentive. Which led him to his next decision. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his sleek black leather wallet, and left it on the table. It wasn't just a wallet, it contained his ID, credit cards, and business contacts that any ambitious person would love to have. Then, without looking back, he stood up and stepped outside, pretending to check his phone while keeping an eye on the cafe window. It didn't take long. Through the glass, he saw Olivia pause mid-step as she noticed the wallet. A small frown crossed her face as she picked it up. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at it. Then, with a decisive nod, she walked over to the counter and handed it to the barista. "I think the man at table 5 left this," she said. The barista glanced at the expensive leather. "Do you know him?" "No," Olivia replied, shaking her head. "But it's better if you hold on to it. He might come back." Brandon smiled to himself. She hadn't even opened it. Hadn't checked for cash or identification. She had simply done the right thing, without hesitation. But just as he was about to step back inside, something else caught his attention. Olivia winced, her hand instinctively moving to her belly, her face briefly contorting in pain. It was quick, just a flicker of discomfort before she straightened and resumed working as if nothing had happened. But Brandon had seen enough. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than detachment. He felt curiosity. He felt concern. And more than anything, he felt the unmistakable urge to know more about Olivia's story. Brandon waited until the cafe had quieted down before stepping back inside. Olivia spotted him immediately, and as he approached the counter, she was already holding up his wallet. "Forgot something?" she asked, offering him a slightly embarrassed smile. Brandon took the wallet, pretending to check its contents, though he already knew everything was intact. "Thank you for being honest." "It's no problem," she said, brushing off the praise as if it meant nothing. But it did mean something, to him. At least. He hesitated, then asked, "Can I ask you something?" Olivia looked wary but nodded. "Why are you working so hard? Especially in your condition? Shouldn't you be resting?" Her expression darkened slightly. For the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "Resting doesn't pay the rent," she said quietly. Brandon studied her face, noting the way her jaw tightened as if she expected him to push further. "Is there no one helping you?" Her body stiffened, and for a second, she looked like she wanted to walk away. "That's not really your business," she said, her voice measured. Brandon raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fair enough. But if you ever need help, I won't," she cut in. He nodded, though he didn't believe her. As he left the cafe, his mind raced. Olivia was unlike anyone he'd ever met, fiercely independent, honest to a fault, and clearly carrying more burdens than she let on. He should let it go. Leave Charleston behind and return to his world of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. But something about her wouldn't let him. That evening, Brandon sat in his temporary rental overlooking the ocean, scrolling through emails on his laptop. But his focus kept slipping. He found himself thinking about Olivia, the way she winced in pain but kept working. The way she refused money but never complained. The way she stood her ground even when it was easier to accept help. She reminded him of himself. Years ago, he had clawed his way out of poverty and obscurity, working tirelessly to build his empire. But there was a difference. He had always known he would succeed. Olivia's world felt far less certain. The next morning, he returned to the seaside haven. This time, when Olivia approached his table, she raised an eyebrow. "You're back." Brandon smirked. "I'm a man of habit." "Coffee and a croissant?" she asked, already jotting down the order. He nodded. "You catch on fast." She gave him a small smile. But there was still something guarded about her. She wasn't used to people noticing her. Brandon wanted to change that. But just as he was beginning to understand her, someone from her past arrived, someone who could destroy everything they had begun to build. The cafe door swung open with a sharp chime, and a sudden shift in Olivia's expression told Brandon something was wrong. She stiffened, her entire body tensing as if she had been caught in a trap. Brandon followed her gaze to the man standing just inside the doorway. He was tall, rugged, and unshaven, wearing jeans and a worn-out flannel as if he had been on the road for days. There was something in his stance, hesitation mixed with determination, that set Brandon on edge. The man's eyes scanned the cafe, and when they landed on Olivia, his lips parted as if he were about to say something. But before he could, Olivia turned on her heel and walked straight toward the kitchen, vanishing behind the swinging door without a word. Brandon observed the man carefully. The stranger hesitated for only a moment before striding toward the counter. The barista, a college-aged kid, looked up in surprise as the man leaned forward. "Olivia," he said, his voice low but firm. "Can you tell her I need to talk to her?" The barista frowned. She's kind of busy." Brandon set down his coffee, already piecing things together. This wasn't just some old acquaintance. This was someone important, someone she didn't want to see. Deciding not to wait for answers, Brandon stood up and walked to the counter, standing just a few feet away. "You looking for Olivia?" The man turned sharply, eyeing him warily. "Yeah, you know her?" Brandon shrugged. "Maybe." The man exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I need to talk to her." The kitchen door swung open, and Olivia emerged, her face unreadable but her eyes filled with tension. "Jake," she said flatly. Brandon glanced at her, watching her carefully. So this was him, the father of her child, the man who had left. Jake shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between her and Brandon. "Can we talk? Alone?" "No." Olivia's response was immediate, her voice firm. Jake clenched his jaw. "Olivia, come on, just 5 minutes." Brandon didn't move, but his presence was unmistakable. He was there, a witness, a quiet force at her back. Olivia's hands tightened into fists at her sides. "Whatever you have to say, say it here." Jake let out a slow breath, looking suddenly uncertain. I heard you were struggling. I thought maybe I could help." Olivia laughed, but it was hollow, sharp. "You thought you could help?" Jake swallowed hard. "I know I messed up. Okay? But I've been thinking, and I want to make things right." Her face was impassive. "You don't get to decide that now." Silence settled between them. Brandon watched as Olivia stood her ground, refusing to let the past shake her. Jake wasn't expecting this version of her. Strong, unyielding, unwilling to let him waltz back in as if nothing had happened. And Brandon? He had never admired her more. As the weeks passed, the tension between Olivia, Jake, and Brandon simmered just beneath the surface. Jake lingered in town, trying to prove he had changed. But Olivia remained cautious. She had spent too long surviving on her own to suddenly trust the man who had walked away when she needed him most. Through it all, Brandon was there, not as someone trying to replace Jake, but as someone she could count on. He didn't push her for answers, didn't pressure her to make decisions before she was ready. He simply showed up, at doctor's appointments, at the cafe after long shifts, at quiet moments when she didn't even realize she needed someone by her side. And one evening, as she sat across from him, watching him go over notes for yet another charity project, Olivia realized something. She didn't have to do it alone anymore. "I've been thinking," she said hesitantly. Brandon looked up, waiting. She took a breath. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want you in it." Brandon's expression softened, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then, without hesitation, he reached across the table and took her hand. "You already have me," he said simply. Months later, when Olivia finally held her newborn daughter in her arms, a little girl named Amelia Grace, she looked over at Brandon, watching him cradle the baby with a look of pure love and devotion. For the first time in a long time, Olivia felt safe. And for Brandon, the man who once believed love was just another transaction, he finally found something money could never buy: family. If you enjoyed this story, Subscribe to Life Stories for more heartwarming tales of love, resilience, and the unexpected moments that change our lives forever.